Well, basically, the USAID admitted what we already knew, what all of us have been saying for a while, that this humanitarian aid, that this support for Venezuela was contingent upon basically pushing Maduro out and putting in, of course, their regime change candidate and the Gusano and our great friend, right? And they admitted this in this whole like brief. It was kind of an audit report of what they could have done better. And basically throughout the whole report, they basically just talk about how they needed more interference. Basically, they were like, we should have had more communication between the National Security Council and the USAID. So here's the title. It's the enhanced processes and implementer requirements are needed to address challenges and fraud risks in USAID's Venezuela response. So that's what we're going to be going over. I have a few parts on this that I'm going to focus on. So let's start reading this, because this is what
you want to start with. Page 3 first, though, you said, right?
Yeah, we're going to do the memorandum first, which is
it's not there.
It's not up there. Okay,
if you go right there and you scroll down. Yeah.
Let me just go down here. And just so you guys get a brief idea as to what this is about. So this memorandum transmits the final report on our audit of the USAID's response to the Venezuela regional crisis. Our audit objectives were to, 1, assess the challenges USAID faces in responding to the Venezuelan regional crisis, 2, assess USAID's management of fraud risk in its humanitarian response to the Venezuelan regional crisis. In finalizing the report, we considered your comments on the draft and excluded them in their entirety, blah, blah, blah. So it's going to have 6 recommendations to improve the USAID's humanitarian assistance policies, processes, and managements of fraud risk. And it's going to strengthen the agency's strategic planning for development assistance programs in response to audit. And that's that. So you guys know what we're talking about. But really, what we really want to get to is just the admission by the USAID of how they acted upon to bring in this humanitarian aid, right? So the crisis in Venezuela, they talk about the background. The crisis in Venezuela has roots in 2 events, right, that changed the trajectory of the Venezuelan society. They talk about the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013 and the collapse of the global oil prices in 2004. And in the wake of Chavez's death, Nicolas Maduro assumed the presidency in March of 2013. And this is, according to them, escalated a campaign of political regression, erosion of Venezuelan democratic institutions, because America knows what's democratic or not, and increasing control over all aspects of daily life in Venezuela. At the same time, Venezuela's oil-dependent economy was in a state of collapse due to mismanagement, extensive corruption, and global declines in oil prices. Hyperinflation soared and reached 9,500% at the end of 2019, rendering the country's currency worthless. They did not mention the sanctions that the U.S. government imposed on Venezuela. While Maduro, they continue, was sworn in for a second term as president in January 2019, after a controversial election, the U.S. government recognized our friend Gusano Juan Guaido as the democratically elected president of the National Assembly of Venezuela, even though he was literally no one, and the interim president of Venezuela. I thought Scoop Gang was the interim president of Venezuela. And to address urgent humanitarian needs and restore democratic governance to Venezuela, the U.S. government's key foreign policy goals were to, 1, support Guaido's legitimacy as interim president of Venezuela, 2, increase pressure on Maduro to step down as president accordingly. USAID prioritize aid to the Venezuelan people in coordination with the interim president. There it is, right there. Accordingly, USAID prioritized aid to the Venezuelan people in coordination with Juan Guaido, which something they shouldn't have done, because it would be like picking a random freaking, not even a congressperson, and bringing them in and saying they're the interim president. If that. And this included issuing in-kind grants to distribute humanitarian commodities inside Venezuela and signing a developmental objective grants agreement for $200 million in development programs in Venezuela through the year 2024. And okay, so that's some of what they admitted so far. Pasta, is it anything that you thought was different? Like, I mean, it's pretty obvious.
No, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but this is the point I kind of hit home when we talked to a lot of the people that, okay, like, well, Donald Trump didn't start any wars. Yeah, but he continued the same policies of regime change and trying to make this happen in the global South. And it really goes to the core of their main issue.
Right.
And I'm saying a lot of older conservatives who supported Donald Trump believe that immigration is a problem, migration is a problem, too many immigrants into this country. And they say it's taking away medicine from citizens, it's taking away jobs from citizens and stuff. Okay, well, if you don't have these policies in the global South, which is really just trying to tear the country apart to get the leadership you want in there, that's the corporations, then you wouldn't have so much migration. And Donald Trump, make no mistake about it, he might not have started his own separate war the way Obama did and Bush did and Clinton did and all this bullshit, but he continued the same policies which lead to your number one issue. You wouldn't need a friggin' wall if you didn't push these types of policies, which is going to tear the country apart. I mean, they're literally trying to make Guaido. That's like what we did this in assistance with Juan Guaido. The people of Venezuela didn't select Juan Guaido to be anything.
And Venezuela's elections are some of the most fair and transparent of all, by the way. So again, it was revealed that their election was fair.
Well, you know what they do? They do their own exit polls. The citizens, them in Bolivia, they're very smart about that.
So the USAID's office, to continue this, right, of the administrator issued a directives to the OFDA and FFP for the Venezuelan regional crisis in response to appeals from the Venezuelan interim government and foreign policy guidance from the National Security Council and State Department. In January and February of 2019, the U.S. government identified the USAID's humanitarian assistance for Venezuelans as also serving a key tool to elevate support to the Venezuelan interim government and increase pressure on the Maduro regime. Again, they're admitting all of their aid was contingent upon regime change. These directives communicated instructions to the OFDA and FFP on the use of the agency's humanitarian assistance resources in response to the crises, including taking actions that deviated from humanitarian principles and heightened security and fiduciary risks. Our interviews with USAID officials identified the following concerns with the Office Administrative Directives. And so they talk about their concerns and how they struggled to communicate, and they needed better communication and coordination and basically to be more involved, right? And then the Office of the Administrative's directive to the pre-positioned humanitarian commodities was not driven by technological expertise or fully in line with the humanitarian principles of neutrality, independence, and being based on needs assessments. The directive also increased fiduciary and security risks throughout the following actions. They said that they basically, like what I said, is they should have tried harder to communicate better and to be more in line, but they're not criticizing the fact that they literally involve themselves in something they shouldn't have in the first place. So this is just this isn't an audit, really. This is oh, look how we did. We did pretty great. I mean, we had our troubles here, but the OFDA and the FFP spent approximately $2 million to purchase transport. This is important here. 368 metric tons of humanitarian commodities to the Colombia-Venezuela border and Curacao from February 2019 through April of 2019. By August of 2019, only 8 metric tons of commodities were delivered to Venezuela, and the remaining 360 metric tons were distributed inside Colombia or shipped to Somalia. Not all of these humanitarian commodities were pre-positioned based on needs assessments. For example, the transported commodities included ready-to-use supplemental food that the OFDA and FFP had already determined wasn't necessary because of the nutritional status of Venezuelan children did not warrant its use at the time. So at the same time, they're saying that Venezuelans are starving and they're leaving because if you guys recall during this whole back and forth, basically Maduro pushed them out because he didn't want the West interfering in the elections, but they made in not in the elections, but in the government.
Yeah.
But they made it, they gave the aid only if Maduro cooperated, right? So it wasn't about giving these people the aid to these poor, starving Venezuelans. It was to use it as like a dog treat to trick like the dog to come in and bite and bite and, you know, and come to you basically in that way. Like that's how the United States operated. So they took away the aid when Maduro didn't cooperate. Colombia, of course, is right next to Venezuela just for geographical purposes. And Colombia has been instrumental in being manipulated because the Colombian government is working directly with the U.S. State Department and manipulating the resources that never got to Venezuela, as you can see. So all of that was bullshit. They also talk about Peru and Ecuador because of the migrant situation that I mentioned in the last show, is that a lot of Venezuelans are coming into these countries and becoming like, you know, like, what is it? Like third class citizens there. And so they mention that aspect of that as well. So the last one, I think this is the last one. So on February 23rd, 2019, trucks carrying these commodities were violently stopped. This is how they describe it at border crossings by Maduro-controlled Venezuelan security forces, which resulted in injuries to civilians and the destruction of approximately 34,000 of USAID's commodities. In response to the attempted delivery of USAID humanitarian commodities into Venezuela, the Maduro regime closed Venezuela's border with Colombia. In February 2019, and then they talk about how this contributed to the tense environment for humanitarian assistance funded by or associated with the U.S. government as the Maduro regime publicly rejected pre-positioned commodities and initiated security crackdowns in Venezuela. Again, Maduro did not want the United States to push regime change, so he was responding to that. They could have still given the aid in other ways. They actually sanctioned Venezuela and like impeded any sort of aid from getting to them, especially during the coronavirus pandemic. They did everything they could to stop Venezuelans from getting aid. Let's not forget that. What they're saying here is completely omitting that other part of the story. The Office of the Administrator directed the OFDA and FFP to align their award decisions towards reinforcing the interim government's credibility. The OFDA and FFP minimized funding to the UN agencies, even though some UN agencies had infrastructure in Venezuela to deliver humanitarian commodities, because the interim government was concerned that the United Nations supported the Maduro regime. Right here, guys, they're telling you that they literally minimized the funding to other agencies that could deliver this aid because they were cooperative or supposedly cooperative with the Maduro regime. You have to read in between the lines here. You have to understand the context. Like, these people are admitting what they did, but they're framing it in a way that's like, well, we were just doing the best to work with the Venezuelan interim president of Juan Guaido. Yeah. And like, nobody can, like, this is like the actual proof of what we've been talking about, what a lot of people have been talking about. But at the same time, they frame it like, oh, look, like they were just trying to help and mean old Maduro stopped them. And they didn't want to support Maduro. And, you know, and the OFDA funded 2 applications from the Venezuelan non-governmental organization, an NGO, in part because the organization was perceived by the Office of Administrators as supporting the U.S. government foreign policy interests in Venezuela. So they're telling you they funded one NGO that was supporting America, but the other ones that were more neutral, probably, I highly doubt that they were pro-Maduro, were, you know, completely just devoid of any funding. And of course, that would have been the way of getting these people the aid without overstepping your boundaries and trying to interfere in Maduro's government or imposing regime change. Yeah. So there it is, guys. And I think, I'm sorry, there was one more. The official stated that as part of a rapid response to the onset of the crisis, they prioritized project and award planning requirements instead of dedicating extensive time to strategic planning. They developed project appraisal documents, conducted technical assessments, and initiated award designs rather than developing strategic frameworks. They're self-criticizing here right now. They're talking about how they could have done better, but they're really not talking about, again, the omission as to why they were there in the first place, because we're going to talk about what the USAID is. And they said that the crisis in Venezuela was likely to be protracted, with Venezuelan migration expected to be a long-term development challenge in Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru. To meet these challenges, developing strategic frameworks could strengthen the LAC and SA's and USAID's SAR's objectives and development programs through better planning and strategies. Okay, so that is basically telling us that they're going to continue to do this. They're going to continue interfering in the global south, specifically right now in Latin America. They mentioned Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru because, well, Brazil's got, the political situation where Lula was freed, but they're still under a right-wing regime and with Bolsonaro. And then you have Ecuador, which the neoliberal / neocon just won in a really election that was manipulated and had interference from the United States government. And then you have Peru, right? Which is there's a leftist right now running against Keiko Fujimori, who's like the right wing candidate, daughter of Alberto Fujimori, who had a dictatorship in the country. But again, Peru is very, very much anti-left because of the history with the Shining Path and the manipulations, of course, by the U.S. and the CIA. So you have these three countries that it's so much could happen there. We were hoping with Ecuador that the United States would be pushed out, but now they've privatized their banks. And Brazil, we still have Bolsonaro in power, and Peru seems to be the one that's there to watch. If the United States sees that Peru starts cooperating in any way, shape, or form with Nicolas Maduro or with Bolivia's MAS party, Movement for Socialism, then they're going to start interfering again, and they're basically laying it out for you.
Yeah, I also want to point out that a lot of people are going to say, well, why is it up to us to bring aid and to help out these people? Whatnot. We also have to factor in the situation that we put sanctions on these countries, okay, that we stop their banking needs. And, Maduro at one point when there was a malaria outbreak in the Amazon region of Venezuela needed to get a lot of insulin. Well, he couldn't get the banking needs he needed to get it from Colombia, neighboring Colombia, to get that insulin. Instead, he had to go the long route and get it from India, which then took weeks and months because the sanctions that they put on and Colombia's government is a puppet government of the United States, and therefore we cripple them. Just like we took their gold, we seized their gold. England did, you know what I'm saying, in these banks and whatnot. We cause these problems because we want to cause chaos within that country, within the people, so they fight each other. And also, too, I don't want to just mention that Bolsonaro and some of these goons, it's not that you're just right-wing governments, they're corporatist governments too as well. They give over their natural resources to these corporations, and what they're doing in Brazil right now is disgusting in the rainforest. Right. You know what I'm saying?
They're giving controlled it up to by the United States, and they're global capitalists because they want they're basically selling all their natural resources. You see the Amazon situation in Brazil.
It's terrible.
And that's, it's the exploitation, once again, of nature and the embracing of corporatism that the United States and the West are attempting in the global South. Now, what is the USAID? Because a lot of people may not know. Well, it's basically a CIA front, guys. It's basically a CIA front. There was a New York Times article in 2014, an op-ed, right? And this author basically laid it out. And he said the USAID was created in 1961 to help the United States win the, quote, hearts and minds of citizens in poor countries through civic action, economic aid, and humanitarian assistance. As a Cold War policy tool, the agency was at times used as a front for CIA operations and operatives. Among the most infamous examples was the Office of Public Safety, a USAID police training program in the Southern Cone that also trained torturers. And this guy is actually, he's kind of touches on it, but he doesn't go full there. He talks about how in the 21st century, the USAID has overcome the tainted legacy and undertaken humanitarian, political, and economic work around the globe. I disagree. It runs democracy promotion efforts from Afghanistan to Kenya, building political leadership capacity, electoral education, and registration programs and judicial reform projects with little controversy. Again, now we know that's not true, especially when you talk about the Horn of Africa. It is when USAID undertakes discrete regime change operations that it runs into trouble. Indeed, its Office of Transition Initiatives now seems to be competing with, or at least complementing, the CIA on high-tech propaganda and destabilization programs in Cuba, if not elsewhere as well. Okay, so this was 2014, and that was said, right? I don't think they'd print anything close to that now in the New York Times. And I just want to basically finish up on a couple of things that this continues, because we had on April 28th, Samantha Power say, confirmed. Thank you, everyone, for your support these last months. I'm so grateful for this bipartisan vote of confidence from the Senate. I'm sure it was. And so energized to be joining the incredible USAID team to get big things done. The agency's work around the world has never been more vital. So there you go. And she was voted in. And then we have Carlos Vecchio. We congratulate Ambassador Samantha Power on her confirmation as administrator of USAID. Our conviction is to continue working together to address critical, complex humanitarian emergency generated by dictator Maduro. U.S. support for the people of Venezuela is critical. We know that Anthony Blinken also indicated that they were going to be involved in getting rid of Maduro. And of course, Carlos Vecchio is a self-described ambassador of the Venezuela ante los EUU, Estados Unidos, United States. And he wants to change Venezuela, but he is a literal gusano pasta who like exposed him.
Yeah. Oh, well, Max Blumenthal had him when they had the embassy protectors there. He caught him in the streets, whatnot, and started speaking to him. He really didn't have much to say, Mr. Vecchio. He kind of sidestepped things and walked away. But once again, this is like a puppet regime that they're trying to prop up in Venezuela. I mean, it's disgusting. The CIA has run throughout the global South for so long, fam, and taught a lot of the opposing governmental oppositions like torture techniques and whatnot. And really, we've seen this before. People have talked about it, but you said it right there in that New York Times article where we were going in there and we're implementing our imperialistic kind of ways and what we do all along the global South and everything.
It's always under the guise of humanitarian aid. But if we cared about humanitarian aid, we wouldn't go around the world bombing people and overturning regimes. Like, we obviously don't care about humanitarian aid in Palestine or Yemen if our interests aren't on there. Okay, so the last part that I have to mention is who was the president of the USAID, who was the chief guy, right? And he just stepped down to go work for the McCain Foundation. So props to him. But his name is Mark Green, and 2 years ago, he had some remarks on countering malign Kremlin influence. So I just want to point some of the things he says so you know who's really in the USAID and what they stand for, because this is really disgusting right here. This is who they are. He said, at USAID, we're stepping forward to assist democracies and institutions who may be targeted by Kremlin aggression. We've crafted a framework for this assistance that we call Countering Malign Kremlin Influence, or CMKI. CMKI responds to authoritarian challenges by increasing the economic and democratic resilience of targeted countries and working to mitigate the effects of Kremlin soft power aggression upon a range of institutions. Took a lot of bullshit to say we like to interfere in Russia's affairs and get rid of Vladimir Putin. Okay, so as part of these efforts, the USAID is prepared to support independent regulatory authorities, whatever that means, right? And strengthen the cybersecurity of regional energy utilities. We will also assist partners in efforts to diversify exports more effectively, compete in Western markets, and meet the demands of international markets and standards. This work is well underway, in places like Ukraine,
the poorest nation,
where we are supporting efforts to transition power systems from synchronous connection with Russia to a new connection with
Yeah. We're going to help the neo-Nazis that we've been helping since World War II.
We're going to continue doing that because we're anti-authoritarian.
God.
In response to past Kremlin efforts to hack Ukraine's elections, USAID provided approximately $2.7 million in election cybersecurity equipment and training for their Central Election Commission this year in order to support free and fair elections. Why don't you start with your fucking country?
Yeah.
Close observers tell us that these tools and training made a significant difference. Across the region, USAID is supporting a new generation of young political leaders. Oh, are they? To help build support the enabling environment for civil society groups. We're also providing grants to grassroots organizations across the region that focus on promoting good governance and citizen advocacy. There you go, talking about those NGOs.
Citizen advocacy.
We're dedicated to helping citizens recognize disinformation efforts and to see them for what they are. For example, in Georgia, USAID is supporting an initiative crowdsource efforts to help identify and track anti-Western disinformation. We're working with hundreds of Georgian volunteers online, and with our support, 11 independent and credible media partners across Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia are growing their audiences, diversifying their revenue, and elevating their digital media presence to push back on disinformation. Liberty and democracy emerged in Europe and Eurasia only after remarkable acts of physical and moral courage, from D-Day to tearing down the wall, from solidarity to the Baltic's human chain. CMKI honors all those heroes for what they fought for: human dignity, private enterprise, and free markets, citizen responsive governance, lifting lives, building communities, creating hope.
Creating hope, fam.
Yeah. So
there it is.
That just tells you who they are. These people basically are the CIA, and they go around the world pushing regime change, trying to overthrow their democratically elected leaders that may or may not be leftists, right? Whatever you think of Putin, I don't think he's a leftist at all. But they want to get and they're doing the same thing. That's all they are. This is what people need to really be talking about. These are the subjects we need to understand in order to understand where all this money is going, why do we have an immigration issue, and why the world hates us.
Yeah. I mean, there's an immigration issue that's going on in Europe for what we did in Libya. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? They're literally, people are dying, trying to cross over the waters to get over into Europe, and now they're on their doorstep. And Gaddafi talked about this. And he was on our side before he wasn't on our side. As soon as he wanted to start his own currency, one of the richest nations in Africa, where some of the citizens had some of the best, Medicare, education, whatnot, they were taken care of over there. Once we remove that regime, we now have a slave trade over there, and now you have a migration problem. This happens all the time. They use these NGOs, they use these fronts. Everything they do, it makes it sound good, right, fam? And how are they going to enforce these things? Well, the CIA is then going to direct the generals and the military to do their dirty bidding. And that's why we are where we are today when it comes to the global South.
Yeah.
All right.